Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Angela Brennan and today I'm bringing you Spellbinders 3D Embossing Folder of the Month, Floral Expressions. It's a really pretty embossing folder with a floral background, and there's so many techniques you can do with this embossing folder, and I proceed to show you that in this video. As usual, I start off by just embossing it with just a plain white Strathmore Bristol smooth card, and then you use the right sandwich for a 3D embossing folder, and I put a heavy object on it and let it dry so that it dries straight and the card is not warped despite the spraying of some water. The water is meant to soften the fibers in the card so when it's put through the embossing sandwich it does not crack. Now I'm just going to apply some Distress Oxide inks very gently onto the embossed panel so it highlights all the raised parts of the embossed panel like the flowers, the foliage, and I use 4 different colors to do it. In fact, I even use a distress ink with a smaller blending brush, just to put a little bit of a darker color in the middle of the big flowers. I like doing this because I think it really gives you a chance to color the embossed panel without too much care, as in not too much detail, but just do it as gently as you can. You don't have to be too precise about it, but the color that you add to the embossed panel really brings out and draws out the highlighted parts or the raised parts of the embossed panel. And I really like doing this technique. And once you've completed adding the color of the Distress Oxide inks onto the raised part of the embossed panel, you can put it through the embossing folder or the embossing machine again by locking, and I say locking in quotes, the panel into the embossing folder again and putting it through the same sandwich so the embossed panels are reinvigorated or to ensure they've not flattened while you've been coloring it or inking it. I like doing this technique because it gives me a little bit more flexibility to add the colors in a loose manner. Now I'm going to use similar colors, but I'm going to add the colors onto again a Strathmore Bristol smooth card, but I'm going to add it randomly. I have the embossing folder to my left, which is not on the screen, but I'm randomly seeing where the flowers and foliage are, and I'm going to be adding colors accordingly. So I use 4 Distress Oxide inks here, but when I use the greens next to the red, I'm quite careful because I don't want to end up with a brown muddy mess. So I try not to let the colors meet too much. So even if there's a little bit of white in between, it doesn't matter because when it goes through the embossing folder, you can't really see the white parts because the floral pattern of the embossing folder does kind of mask all the spare or the white parts of the inked panel. So I'm just trying to make sure it matches as best as I can, and I think it looks really pretty. But I'm putting it back in because I'm going to go to the other side of the embossing folder, the flat side, and put some VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink pad. So this is a black ink, pigment ink, and I'm putting it through the embossing machine again, and the background is covered with a dark color, and I really think this looks really pretty because it looks like the background card was black. I really like how this card turned out. It's really pretty. For the next card, I'm going to use again similar colors, but I'm going to be putting the colors in a horizontal way and doing some ink blending because I think you can use similar colors and get quite different looks. Again, I'm applying the inks on the Strathmore Bristol smooth card. Every time I apply ink, I'm putting it on that card because it blends so beautifully. I'm using my Wow heat embossing tool, and I'm using the lower, the first level of the heating to just dry up the ink before I add a slightly darker ink at the top, which is the H Mahogany Distress Oxide ink, because I thought it'd be nice to put a slightly darker ink and blend it through before I add the peacock feathers to add that additional teal to give that background a little bit of a pop. because I didn't want it to be too of a sunsetty color, but I'm just going to add a little bit of a pop because I do love peacock feathers because it's a nice teal to add to it. Again, I'm not blending it too much because I'm going to put it through the embossing folder. And when I do put it through the embossing folder, I'm putting it on the debossed side. So I'm getting a debossed image. And you're right, I'm going to use my VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink pad again and just lightly swipe it so it hits all the flat bits and you can see the debossed image come through. Now this is a pigment ink, so it doesn't dry easily, which is why I'm using a scrap card so that I don't make a mess of it. But what I'm going to do now, you can see the embossed on the left, the debossed on the right. They both look beautiful because the 3D embossing folder is a lovely floral image. I'm putting sprinkling some really light, super fine embossing powder just on the border or the inner part of the border, very, very loosely and very, very randomly on the card. And I'm going to be heat embossing or melting that embossing powder from the back of the card because I don't want it to fly away. So I'm using a second level or the highest level of the heat embossing tool to melt that embossing powder. And I just like the slight shine that comes through that debossed image. Here is a red card which I just embossed, and I'm using the Altenew Enchanted Gold pigment ink and lightly rubbing it so it hits all the raised to highlight the raised parts of that image. So you see a beautiful image, and you can just put that on the front of a card. And I use that onto an A7 card. Same thing I've done here with a dark blue card, but I'm going to show you here. I'm going to first swipe my white pigment ink on the debossed side. So this is a pretty image as well, so you can use it on the debossed side just as well as you can use it on the embossed side. And then I'm going to flip it, and I'm also going to show you how it looks by swiping the white pigment ink onto the embossed side of the same card. But I do like the embossed side a little bit better, but I also do end up, because the pigment ink takes forever to dry, I do sprinkle it with the super fine clear embossing powder, and again I will be heat embossing it to set that embossing powder or melt that embossing powder with my heat tool. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And when you do subscribe, remember to press that notification bell so you're alerted when new videos are uploaded. I love embossing folder techniques, and there's so many ways you can use it, but you need to find the right pattern, the right composition. And here are all the embossing backgrounds that I've done, and I'm going to convert all of this into cards. Now I don't show you how I convert all of them into cards, but you get to see all the completed cards by the end of the video. Here I'm going to be using the small die of the month Colorful Expression Sentiments. This is part of the Spellbinders Clubkits August 2024, and I'm going to be using these sentiments for the cards I'm going to be completing. The small die of the month comes with so many word dies as well as the shadow of the word dies that you can create your own sentiments by putting the words together. For some of this particular card, I'm making a sentiment enclosed hugs. I'm doubling up the die cut, but I'm also making a slight shadow of the die cut with a white die cut just to give it a little bit of, to just allow it to pop against the darker background. And I always use a slightly larger card to do my embossing, so when I put it onto the front of the base card, it's not something I need to be too careful with, because I can just place it on and just cut off all the balance that sticks out of the base card so the card front is nice and flush. I like doing that all the time, and I tend to use the A6 card, which is a common card size in the UK, which measures 10.5 centimeters by 14.8 centimeters. And when I'm putting my sentiments on the front of the card, I always have my T-ruler ready, so it is easy to ensure that I get the sentiment nice and straight. And here's a card I've completed, rather quite straightforward and quick, hugs enclosed. I do love the sentiments that come with a small die of the month. It's so versatile. You can create different sentiments. And here's another sentiment that I'm creating, and this time I'm using the shadow die as well to say big thanks. I like how this card turned out. In fact, I should have made a couple more cards using this technique. I particularly enjoy this because it's quite versatile. Here I'm going to be using some distress inks to create the background before I die cut. I die cut the words that I want to. And I always say with distress inks, always get the refills because they do dry out. And before you use it, make sure it's nice and juicy. So here's me quickly refilling, using the refill to make sure my distress ink pad is nice and juicy so I can take it the direct ink pad to paper method because I'm going to be using that as the background to die cut the words that I want to. I like using this because it means I don't have to store too much of my pattern paper or colored paper, so I can use my inks that I have in my stash to create the colors that I want to, die cut accordingly and put it onto the front of the card. Here I'm going to be die cutting Have a Wonderful Colorful Day Friend. I'm not going to be using the shadow die, but I do die cut them and I do double them up. Whenever I use a word die, I do tend to put a couple of layers, sometimes 2 layers, sometimes 3 layers. It depends really on the thickness of the card because I think it gives that sentiment a little bit more robustness, and sometimes it can even get to like almost like a chipboard, and it allows you to give that sentiment some dimension on the card front, and it's also easier to put it on straight onto the card front, but always with the aid of a T-ruler. The worst thing I want to do is mess up putting the sentiment onto the card front after I finish the card. So here the card background is just a very simple white card, again Strathmore Bristol smooth card. I've just put it through the embossing folder and just put that onto the card front. This is also an A6 card. Almost all my cards I make in this video as an A6 size card, bar 2 cards where I do an A7 sized card. I'm using T-ruler to ensure that I do have it straight on. I'm not having any measurements done. I'm just eyeballing it and making sure it's in the middle, as well as there is a similar space between each line of the sentiment. Because this is a longer sentiment, I decided to put it right front on the card and just space it by eyeballing it. I could have used a shadow for this. I think a shadow for this sentiments would have done well, but it's only after I finished the card I thought, a shadow would have looked nice, but a little bit too late. So I'm just going to go with it. All the products that I've used in this video is listed in the description below, and as much as I remember, sometimes I miss some products. If I have missed the products, just ask me in the comments and I will add it accordingly. But I have added them below as much as I can, so it's for your ease of reference. I do lots of Spellbinders Clubkits videos, so do check it out. Once I've completed all the Clubkits videos for the month, I tend to put it into a playlist so it's easier for you to reference them once you want to check out a Spellbinders particular month Clubkits. I hope that really helps. I do think that the Spellbinders Clubkits are a great Clubkit set, and I like the fact that it's always in a theme, which is why I tend to store my Spellbinders Clubkits by month, except if they're sentiment heavy, like this month's small die of the month. Here I'm going to be die cutting the sentiment with the shadow, and all I do is I just put a couple of layers of the sentiment, and in fact I've slightly offset the sentiment with a gold die cut as well before I put it onto the shadow, the black shadow, just to give it a slight glimmer to it. So you can use your sentiments and you slightly offset it with a different color before you put it onto your shadow die. I think it gives it a slightly different look as well. So these die cuts can be used in different ways to get different looks to ensure you get more out of your die sets. So here I've got a sentiment again using the various sentiment dies from the small die of the month, and I'm saying, hello friend, miss you. And as usual, always use your T-ruler to place it onto the card front. Here I've put a little bit of dimension tape behind each of the sentiments to just give it that little bit of dimension or a little bit of lift when you put it onto the card front, and I think it just adds a little bit of a pop to the card front. I really love how this card turned out. It's a great way to use different colored inks in your stash to create variations of colors with that technique. I think it's a really great way to see what color combinations work and trying out different inks with that embossing folder technique. Here I'm attaching the embossed and inked image of that red card onto the front of an A7 card. Again, I always emboss larger than the card front, so it's easier to just cut it off so it's nice and flush in the card front. An A7 card measures 5 inches by 7 inches, and this is a top folding A7 card. And it's a very simple design that I've done here. And I've used my A7 dies, put it together, and created a bit of a frame with a gold card, so I can just put it onto the front of the card before I had my sentiment. Again, the sentiment is from the small die of the month, where I simply put hello, and I've done 3 different colors. You got the white die cut, the gold die cut, and the red die cut, and I've layered them differently for each of the 3 hellos. So it's hello, hello, hello. It's just a sentiment that I went with here. Again, with the next card, same thing I do. This time I decided to put some foam sheets behind it to get a bit of dimension and cut the panel slightly smaller than the front of that A7 card. And the sentiment I'm going to use is from the clear stamp of the month, Colorful Expressions Blossom. So I've got the clear stamp as well as the coordinating dies. I'm just stamping the sentiment, which the main sentiments are hello and for you, and there's quite a few sub sentiments which I use for this card. I'm just inking it with some Versamark ink, and of course before I'm going to do any embossing, I treated the card with some anti-static powder, sprinkling it with some superfine gold embossing powder. I'm using a peg here, a wooden peg, to hold the card so I don't burn my fingers before I use my heat tool to melt the embossing powder. And here is the sub sentiment which says on your special day. So it's hello on your special day, and I use the coordinating dies for the hello as well as the rectangle die for the sub sentiment. And I cut it again, use a couple of layers or 3 layers in this instance before I put it on the card front, so it pops with a little bit of dimension. It's really nice to have these sentiments, what I would call generic sentiments, that you can put in card fronts for special occasions, and you can get a lot of use for this. Sometimes it's hard to find some really basic sentiments, and I find this month's Spellbinders Clubkits, both the clear stamp of the month as well as the small die of the month, they've got what you need from a sentiment perspective. This is a different embossing folder technique where I'm just using a stencil of a shape. If you don't have a stencil of a shape, you can use some of your shaped die cuts, die cut it on some scrap paper and use that as a stencil. So I'm using 3 different distress oxide inks here. I'm just inking that stencil shape and oval before I put it through the 3D embossing folder. Just a different way to use it, and I think it looks really pretty. And I also show how I use similar colors with the wax seal of the month, which is just a bold hello. So instead of using the sentiments from the other Spellbinders Clubkits, I'm going to be using the wax seal of the month. So I'm just going to emboss it through the 3D embossing folder, and of course before I emboss it, I'm spraying the back of the inked panel with some water so it softens the fibers of the card and prevents cracking. Now I'm going to put the stencil back onto the embossed panel because I want to swipe the oval with the enchanted gold pigment ink, so it highlights or it captures the raised areas of that embossed panel, so it gives it that special look. But now I'm going to be covering the oval, and I'm going to be sprinkling the background, the white embossed background, with some gold metallic ink. I just think it looks pretty, but you got swipe on the colored part and you got some splatters on the background just to give it a little bit of variation. And then I'm just going to attach that onto the front of an A6 card. And for the sentiment, I'm going to be using the wax seal of the month, the bold hello. Here I'm melting some wax beads. It's the wax seal of the month wax beads. It came with the wax seal of the month, and it's called Must Have Wax Beads. It's a mixture of some variations of pinks as well as a little bit of gold, and I use both of it. I'm using the flame to take away some of the bubbles that come on the wax bead when melted wax beads when I put it onto my mat. And here you've got a beautiful hello, and I will be coloring it with a black Sharpie. Now I do it with a black Sharpie, and then I don't quite like the look of it, and then I end up using some silver paint to paint on top of the hello before I put it onto the card front. So you can you can change it. It doesn't really matter. But I think the black hello with the Sharpie does look quite good against the pink, but it didn't quite go with what I wanted, so I changed it. But I also ended up cutting the wax seal because I didn't like the way it looked. I mean, it's fine the way it looks, but I decided to cut it so it has more of a rectangle shape with a little bit of a frame, and that's how I put it onto the card front. And this card here is a slightly different stenciling that I did before I did some embossing. Here I'm going to be putting the pink wax bead, melted wax beads onto the wax seal of the month, just removing it so the hello is all in pink, and then I'm going to be putting the gold, which is just still same from the same wax bead set, and I'm just going to leave it there for a little while and let it harden before I remove it. And I think it's a great technique. Give it a go. It's nice and pretty once it's done, and you can do it with various color combinations. And I like cutting it when, especially if it's not a perfect circle. I tend to cut it because I like the way it looks, but you can leave it as is as well. It's really up to you. I'm going to be using a panel here, and I'm going to do another technique of embossing here, just attaching the card onto the flat side of the embossing folder, and I'm going to be using Catherine Pooler's ink Pink Champagne, and I'm just dotting it. I don't want to swipe it because sometimes if your ink pad is too juicy, you can get pools of ink in the recesses of the embossing folder, and you don't want that. So I'm doing a light tap before I put it through the embossing machine, and I'm getting a slightly pink background. It looks pink, so I'm just doing it one more time. And if you attach the card securely to the embossing folder, you can do it a few times, especially if the ink initial version either looks too light or a little bit blotchy. Now once I've done a couple of iterations of this, I'm going to take a brighter ink pad and swipe it so it gets onto the highlighted or raised parts of the embossed panel. I do leave it like this for a little while, but hang on and see what I do next. Here I'm just taking a strip of card and doing the same technique by adding the Pink Champagne Catherine Pooler ink onto the flat side of the embossing folder, putting it through the embossing folder, and then you get a debossed view of that. And what I do is what I usually do is just swipe it with the Nocturne ink pad. So this is just a strip of an embossed panel, which I do make a card of later on. You can do it with a strip as well. It doesn't always have to be a full card front. So I wasn't too keen on the pink and pink. I thought there was not much of a contrast. So I'm using the VersaFine Clair Medieval Blue ink, and I'm going to put it through the embossing machine. And there you go. You get a variation of the background. You get a little bit of light pink and darker pink. I like the way it turned out. Here I have a background which is quite dark, and I'm going to be attaching that panel of the debossed image of the 3D embossing folder, and I'm just going to put a couple of thin strips of metallic silver on either side of that panel just to get it to pop a little bit. You don't have to do that, but I find a thin strip of card can add a little bit more to give it that additional pop. Now I could have added a little bit of foam sheet behind that embossed panel to give it an additional dimension. I didn't do that. You don't need to do that because I wanted to keep the card flat because I'm going to send it through the post, so I didn't put that additional dimension. And then I'm going to also add a waxed seal sentiment, and I put a couple of dimension tape to just give it that pop. I like these wax seal sentiments. You know, it's so simple and easy to achieve that beautiful color combinations. And I'm using the wax seal adhesive circles, just cutting a little bit on the side so it fits that rectangle wax seal before I adhere it to the card front. So you can get variations of these colors. I want to experiment more with my wax seals because I think I can do more with it. But with these embossing, or rather these wax seals with sentiments, it's nice and easy. Here are two embossed folders with some stenciling. And here are all the cards that I've created. I really hope you've enjoyed seeing the various embossing techniques that I've seen. There are more. This is not an exhaustive list, but I hope you'd give it a try. Try different color combinations. Try different inks. Try different cards because they can give you different results. So it's about experimentation when it comes with embossing folders. You just got to keep trying. Try with paints, with acrylic paints, with vellum, with acetate, with tin foil. Honestly, I can try so many more techniques and I can continue doing a much longer video. But what I'm aiming to do is almost every time I'm using the embossing folders, especially if I do get the 3D embossing folder, I will try different techniques so you can have a look. Let me know what you think and you can give it a go and see if you come up with different variations. I truly hope you've enjoyed the video and it's inspired you to try different embossing folder techniques. And when you do put it in the comments so I can give it a go as well and others who see it can give it a go as well. So if you do enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And when you do subscribe, remember to press that notification bell so you're alerted when a new video is uploaded. Do look out for my playlist of all the club kits for August 2024, which I will post by the end of the month. Fingers crossed, because there are a couple more videos to come out for the Spellbinders club kits of this month. I'm a little late this month bringing my videos out, but I'll surely get them out and hopefully you're inspired by them. Thank you so much for stopping by. Happy crafting, and I'll catch you at my next video. Do take care.